guys, and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be talking to you guys a little bit about a slightly more serious topic, and that is why I used to hide my reading. So if you guys are new here or you don't know anything about me, then let me introduce myself. My name is Jenna Van Mourik. I'm a writer and a reviewer of books. The main genre that I read in is biblical fiction and Christian fiction, and biblical fiction is kind of like a subgenre within the greater Christian fiction genre. But today I want to talk about why I used to hide that I read, because I used to be really ashamed of what I read, which is kind of ironic considering I read Christian books and Christian fiction, or what's considered Christian at least. So this kind of goes back a ways, I suppose, because I discovered biblical fiction not that recently anymore. I discovered it when I was around 15, and was I 15? No, I was 16 at the time. I discovered it when I was like 16, and I am 20 now. I'm almost 21, so about 4 or 5 years ago since I discovered biblical fiction. But biblical fiction for me used to be something that I really didn't like to talk about very much, especially to my friends, mostly because I kind of felt like, for one thing, if people discovered that I read Christian fiction, they'd make fun of me for being a super goody two-shoes kind of girl. And I really didn't want that to happen, especially in high school, because I just kind of wanted to be cool. I also just wanted to be under the radar and like not attracting attention. I was a very awkward, introverted high school student, I think, in my opinion. People say I'm extroverted now, which I tend to agree with, but I consider myself a socially awkward / socially anxious extrovert. So I am extroverted. It's just that my natural inclination, I also have anxiety, so that keeps me from being as extroverted as I maybe want to be on the inside. On the outside, I used to really seriously hide what I read, because I read biblical fiction, I read Christian fiction, specifically biblical fiction at the time. Now I mostly just read biblical fiction, but at the time I read kind of a healthy mix. But the thing was, I didn't know anyone my age who read Christian fiction, so I kind of didn't like talking about it because it made me feel like an old lady or someone who's boring and doesn't read all the fun YA things. If you want to know more about my testimony, I have previous videos on that. You can go back and find them. I have them saved to playlists on my channel. But basically, in high school, I was kind of going through a dark time. I read lots of YA in high school, and I loved what I read. And that's not to say that I am completely against secular YA or secular books. I did enjoy what I read, but at the time when I was going through a dark period following some death in the family and some other stuff that's just not fun to talk about, I really felt like none of the books I read were doing anything for me. And the reason that I read was because I liked having an escape from reality. And the books that I was reading tended to just make me feel even worse because they were more depressing even so sometimes than my life was. So I started reading Christian fiction, and I made a commitment to see what would happen, what would change in my life if I read Christian fiction for just a month. I read only Christian fiction for a month, and it actually I really enjoyed it, and it gave me a lot of hope during that time. So then I extended my challenge to 6 months, and I really enjoyed it, and I felt like it was just bringing a lot to my life that I couldn't get from other books elsewhere. I was getting a lot more motivation. I was getting a lot more spiritual content, a lot more spiritual like God pouring into me during that time. So I extended my challenge to a full year, and then I pretty much never stopped reading Christian fiction. And I do occasionally read secular books, but it's not popular anymore. I don't read it often, or as often as I used to. My natural inclination now is to reach for a Christian fiction book because I like getting poured into in that way, versus 5 or 6 years ago, the last book I picked up would have probably been a Christian fiction book, and my natural inclination would have been just towards a regular old YA book. So yeah, that's a little bit about my story, the summarized version. But when I got into Christian fiction, I didn't want to tell anyone because I was kind of embarrassed of liking Christian fiction, which is kind of ridiculous when you think about it. But I feel like that's just a recurring theme in terms of Christianity and life as a Christian in general. Sometimes it can be really intimidating to talk about being a Christian or to talk about your faith because you don't want people to judge you for it, or you don't want people to point you out or call you out or single you out and say like, oh, she's a Christian, she does this, or all those kinds of things, you know, especially when you're in high school and you're just trying to disappear into a crowd. Having things that single you out and make you different can make you feel anxious. And that's why, you know, a lot of us tend to not share our faith as much as, you know, we maybe should, or maybe as much as God wants us to share our faith and to live out our faith. Sometimes we can just live very quiet existences as Christians because we don't want anyone to judge us or call us out. And that's not really necessarily what God asks us to do. He asks us to live out our faith and to not be ashamed of him. But at the time I was especially ashamed of biblical fiction because I kind of had built up this notion in my head that people around me kind of thought biblical fiction was sacrilegious. Because if you don't know what biblical fiction as a genre is, it's basically a genre. Do I have an example with me? This will work. It's basically a genre. So this book of Fire and Lions is a fictionalized retelling of the life of Daniel, aka Daniel in the Lion's Den. So it takes a Bible story sometimes and it turns it into a novel, or it's a novel based on a Bible story. Or in this case, these are like my go-to example authors for any time I'm explaining biblical fiction. Connie Lynn Cassette took a verse in the Bible, which is, it'll be easier if I just read you guys the verse, because this is in Joshua 20, verses 1 through 3. Then the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, designate the cities of refuge of which I spoke to you through Moses, that the manslayer who kills any person unintentionally without premeditation may flee there, and they shall become your refuge from the avenger of blood." So she read that verse, and then she created this whole fictionalized series with fictional characters about what it would be like to live in one of those cities of refuge that Joshua and God set up during the early days of Israel's time as a nation in the Bible times. So basically, it just takes a fictional character, a completely fictional story, and just sets it in a biblical time period. There's a lot of different kinds of biblical fiction. Some biblical fiction is specifically about a biblical character or a biblical figure. Some of it is just like regular historical fiction, where it's a completely fictional character that witnesses true historical events in the Bible. Or sometimes it's like, you know, Connie Lynn Cassette's work, where it's a little known figure or a little known piece of the Bible that she then writes a story about. And it's a really incredible genre, and I'm very obviously passionate about it now. I host a book club actually called the Biblical Fiction Buffs to help people find book recommendations in terms of biblical fiction, as well as talk through biblical fiction and kind of turn it into a Bible study. Because for me, once I discovered biblical fiction, it actually motivated me to study the Bible more. So for instance, the first biblical fiction book that I ever read was The Pharaoh's Daughter by Misu Andrews. And after reading this book, I kind of dove fairly deep into my own personal study of the book of Exodus, because this book inspired me so much. This is, of course, about Moses' story and Moses' early life, but this book inspired me so much that it motivated me to study the Bible. And that's kind of, I think, the power of biblical fiction and what I want to bring to people through sharing biblical fiction, which is why I started this channel and why I have my Instagram and my blog and why I started my own book club, because I want to show people the power of books and the power of reading and how God can use it in your life to inspire you or teach you something or motivate you or, you know, to point you towards his word. And I think that's very important. But at the time, I had built up this preconceived little notion, or at least had this notion, that certain people around me would consider biblical fiction sacrilegious because the Bible is the Bible and it shouldn't be tampered with. And I don't think, for the most part, biblical fiction authors are very, very, very aware of that, and they do their extremely best to stick as close to the biblical account as possible, and they go to extreme lengths researching. In fact, that's one of my favorite parts about biblical fiction, is going to the back of the book and reading all of the research the author did and where they got their information from and how they found all the information to tell biblical fiction stories. And to me, it's really no different than any other historical fiction genre. For instance, this is not a Christian fiction book, but this'll do. This is Prisoner of Night and Fog. This is not a Christian fiction book. It is a YA book published by Balzer and Bray, an imprint of HarperCollins. And this is called Prisoner of Night and Fog, and it's about a young girl who experiences, she's completely fictional, but she experiences and witnesses Hitler's rise to power in Nazi Germany during the 1940s. So that's a fictional person, but a real event. And I think biblical fiction is kind of the same thing, where it's a fictional story, but it's a real and true event of the Bible. So to me, it's the same kind of thing, basically. So I used to always get scared that if I told people that I read biblical fiction or that I enjoyed biblical fiction, people would say, oh, you shouldn't read that. That's not right. That's the Bible. You should just be reading the Bible. And to a certain extent, I kind of disagree with that, because for me, reading the Bible used to be really confusing because I just couldn't keep up with it sometimes. It's very difficult for a lot of people to read the Bible, actually. That's why we have so many different translations and versions of the Bible, because some people prefer a more readable translation. Some people prefer a more word-for-word, accurate translation. Some people prefer a literal translation. Some people prefer a figurative translation. I used to work for Lifeway in their bookstores, so I know a lot about biblical translations. But that's why we have so many translations, is because some people find it really hard to read the Bible, and that's why we go to church and why we have Bible studies and all those kinds of things. And for me, especially reading things like Genesis, there's a lot of crazy things that go through Genesis, because it's basically a history book, right? The Old Testament's basically history, and then the New Testament is a little bit of history, but also just our story, you know, as Christians, and going forward from the historical events of the Bible. We're living out the New Testament now, basically. When I was reading Genesis, I would get very confused with all the characters and all the things, and who's Jacob, and which one is Rachel, and is Leah this person or that person, and how many kids did Jacob have, and was Jacob the one with the twin brother, or was that Isaac, and was Isaac the one that was almost slaughtered, or was that Abraham, and was Abraham the first one, or what? It used to really confuse me. I'm fairly knowledgeable on biblical trivia, and that may have been a little bit of an exaggeration, but it used to really confuse me a lot. And then I discovered Jill Eileen Smith's books, and she wrote a series called The Wives of the Patriarchs, and that really helped me start to connect the dots and see the Bible as more of a story than just a series of dates, names, and facts that I had a hard time wrapping my brain around. It's the same kind of thing as when you're in a history class in high school or elementary school, and you have to memorize dates, but they get really confusing and they get jumbled up in your head. Once I read the stories in novel form, I was therefore then able to understand the actual biblical account better, if that makes sense. And of course, I still read the Bible. I'm not saying that you should only read biblical fiction and never read the Bible again, because biblical fiction is fiction. It's not the Bible. In fact, what I encourage people to do in my book club is to read the biblical account as you read the fiction account, so that you can experience both biblical fiction and as well as the Bible itself, and compare and contrast and see what the differences are, what liberties the author have taken, if that makes you comfortable or uncomfortable. If it does make you uncomfortable, let's talk about it in the book club. If it inspires you to do something, let's talk about it in the book club. Or if something in the Bible inspired you, or if you noticed how something in the Bible was similar, let's talk about it in the book club. Let's make discussion. Let's make this healthy discussion, because for me, my reading has sort of converged with my Bible study, if you will. When I read a book about Daniel in the lion's den, I want to go and study Daniel in the lion's den. And then as I study them side by side, things are just revealed to me, and I start to understand more and grasp more about the Bible. But that wasn't always the case, and I used to just feel very ashamed for what I read, not only because no one else I knew was reading Christian books, because Christian books are for old people. They were reading all these books over here. Not only because of that, but because it was biblical fiction, and biblical fiction as a name has a negative connotation to it, because the Bible we know to be the true living word of God, and fiction we know to be basically lies or falsehoods. So when you say those two together, it has a general reaction of making people uncomfortable. So I actually talked to Misu Andrews about this when I met her at Christian Fiction Readers Retreat, but we talked about how we wish people would just say biblical novels or historical fiction novels based on biblical time periods, as opposed to the term biblical fiction, because it just sounds really bizarre. And there were some people that I met, and when I would be reading a book, and they'd ask me, what am I reading? And I'd be like, Of Fire and Lions by Misu Andrews. And they'd be like, what's it about? And I'd be like, it's about this Bible story story and people would go, that's not right, you shouldn't be reading that. So I became very ashamed of my reading. And even then, I started a blog devoted to biblical fiction and devoted to sharing my love for biblical fiction. And to make matters even worse, I didn't tell people that I had a blog. I hardly ever talked about it in real life, and to a certain extent, I do still have difficulty talking about it in real life because I am worried of people judging me and people kind of looking at me weird or saying things about this genre. And if you don't want to read biblical fiction genre, if you don't want to read biblical fiction books, I'm never going to say, oh, well then, that's the kind of person that you are. I'm going to say, that's great. I hope you find another kind of book that you really enjoy. For me personally, these books are how God speaks to me or how God inspires me to go and then dig deeper into his word and how he speaks to me through that. Some people can't read biblical fiction because it confuses them. For me, it does the opposite, and that's A-okay. Some people prefer to read Christian contemporary fiction because it helps them learn how to apply Christian principles in a contemporary world. It's the same kind of thing, basically. And there are books out there for everyone, regardless of whether you read Christian fiction or secular fiction or nonfiction even. There's a book out there for everyone, and that's kind of the beauty and joy of reading. But for me, this is what I really love. And it was hard when people would judge me for that or say things about it, like they thought what I was doing was somehow inherently wrong. But then I created my blog. And even though I didn't tell people about my blog, people found my blog. You guys found my blog. A lot of you guys started to follow it, and you started to comment on my videos and started requesting videos and responding to my Instagram posts and DMing me and asking me for recommendations. And through that, I found a whole community of people that felt the same way I did about this genre. And that helped me not be ashamed of what I read and not be ashamed of reading in general. And at the same time, to not even be ashamed that I'm a Christian. I was never one of those people who was ashamed to be a Christian or didn't tell people I was a Christian. Yeah, people always knew that I was a Christian. I think it's something that I think it would be very hard to hide, especially if you come into my house and you see giant bookshelves full of Bibles and Christian fiction books. But it just made me more confident even. And I started meeting people on the street and they'd say things like, oh, how are you? What's your name? What do you do for a living? And I would say, oh, well, I have a part-time job, but what I really like to do is my blog. And they'd be like, what kind of blog? And then I'd tell them Christian fiction. And then it gave me this opportunity to tell people about what I loved instead of being ashamed of it. And basically, I'm just making this video to say that you should never be ashamed of what you read. And you should never be ashamed just to be a Christian in general. Sometimes I even take Christian fiction books out in public, and not as much as anymore, but I used to take books out and people would be like, oh, I see you're reading a Christian book. Are you a Christian? And then I'd feel bad, so I wouldn't take the book out. I would just read it home. And now I just love taking books out because I love when people ask me, because I've discovered that I get so much fulfillment from talking to you guys and recommending books and doing everything that I do. But I just want to say that you should never be afraid or ashamed of being a Christian, because once you stop being ashamed of it and once you stop being afraid of it, that's when God can start to use you and use you to do big things for him. But yeah, I hope I kind of made my point here. I hope that the moral of this story really came across, is that, you know, I don't have to be ashamed of things anymore. And ironically, when you're a Christian, most of the time you're ashamed of sin. And for me, I was ashamed of the opposite in life. I was ashamed of studying the Bible, and I was ashamed of reading Christian books and Christian literature because I thought people would judge me and make fun of me for it. And then I found friends. And really, I want to just briefly add this here. If you read biblical fiction and you don't know anyone in real life who also reads it, come join my book club, because I've been where you've been, and it's kind of lonely when you are obsessing over this genre and you don't have anyone else to talk about it with because other people think it's weird, or other people don't get it, or other people in your life just aren't readers. So please come join my book club if that's you. But yeah, I just don't be ashamed and don't be afraid. And I really hope that this video spoke to you somehow, or inspired you, and that you guys can take something from it, whether that's not being ashamed of what you read, not being ashamed of God, not being ashamed of being a Christian. And I hope that you can take something from this video and then go and do something about it in your life, whether that's starting a blog and a YouTube channel devoted to talking about Christian fiction and Christian literature, or if that's starting a ministry in your church, or starting something just even local in your own house, just starting to do something. Because once you stop being afraid, that's when God can start to use you and take you to amazing, extraordinary places that you never thought you would go to. And I speak from personal experience, because 2 years ago, I never would have imagined that I would have the great friends that I have from this community. You know, there's just been so many opportunities I've had this past year that I never dreamed I would have ever had before doing this, and that I kind of thought like, oh, it would be impossible to make a career out of being a Christian writer. I used to think that. I didn't know Christian fiction even existed, but I knew that someday I wanted to write Christian fiction without even having like a word for it. And I remember thinking, oh, this would be absolutely impossible. There's no such thing as Christians. You'll never be able to do that. That's impossible. No one can be a Christian writer. But it is possible, and all things are possible for those who believe in God. So yeah, I just hope that you guys take that away from this video and that you enjoyed this video. And if you did, be sure to give it a like and hit the subscribe button if you want to see more content like this. I promise to be back with more fun and exciting videos later on, probably this or next week. But yeah, if you like this video, or if you just have any kind of discussion you want to have in the comments, be sure to leave it down in the comment section below. You can also find me on all of my social media links, handles, and things right here. I'm active pretty much daily, and I post all kinds of bookish things and writing updates and all of the things. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, please go and check out all of those. There are also links in the description box as well. My name is Jenna Van Mourik. I'm an inspired writer and an inspirational fiction reader who reads, writes, and lives for Jesus. Once again, you can find all of my links and everything in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Bye, everyone!